So when you think of story is moving from a place where you're comfortable. So separating from what is known repeatedly and going into the unknown, which is where you feel unsafe. But that's where growth happens. But going into that unsafe period also requires development on your part because you're navigating things that don't have ready-made answers. You're navigating things that people can't tell you. They can give you their information, but you have to develop in order to how to work in this new world. And that's what all movies do, right? The person's in the new world. They're trying to understand how to work in this new world. So the problems that we encounter become pointers to our development. Problems as pointers is probably something you'll hear me say a lot as well. Problems as pointers. So the problems that we encounter become a way for us to recognize what's actually happening in this new world and how we can best start to develop, because we need problems to stay around long enough. If the problem doesn't stay around long enough, we can't develop. If the problem isn't really around long enough, well, then a skill or how-to information really is all you needed. You didn't need any development. But the problem is that whenever people don't develop, you start having people do things that disconnect them from who they are, and they'll do things that aren't true for them. And then 30 years later, they look back and say, I never really lived my life. Maybe I made a lot of money. Maybe I have a great house. Maybe I have kids, but I didn't spend any time with them because I was so busy out there doing something else that I thought I needed to do. So that middle part is where a person has to start developing personal insight in order to learn how to move forward. Welcome to the podcast. In this episode, I'm going to give you some background into why I'm starting this podcast and how it came to be. There's a few other episodes that I've recorded, but I thought this might be a really good introduction for the future podcast to really level set to know why I'll be talking about story and how I got to this point. So this all started for me when I realized that in certain areas of my life, I was deeply in control and I knew what I wanted. But I remember learning for the first time that I was doing work that I was just happy with whatever people gave me. And I remember having this thought as a kid that people who made a lot of money or people who did business just somehow knew that it wasn't something that you could learn. Like, how could anyone learn how to do business? So generally, your role is to go to school, do pretty well, go to college or learn a trade and work for someone and be happy with it. So that was pretty much my plan. If you could even say I had one, I would probably say that was my default thinking because I never really challenged it and never even thought about it. And so that's what I did. So the first job out of college was $19,000 and I was super happy with it because I was making a salary. I wasn't even thinking about dollar amount, but it was $19,000. And I quickly found out that's not a lot of money, especially when you're newly married, to live on. I couldn't even pay insurance and rent and everything after I bought some necessities from one of my checks. And I was like, yeah, I probably should do something different. But it was a conversation that I heard some of my friends having that started to open the door a little bit for me. So me and two of my buddies, we worked at the same job and we were making $19,000. And I remember them arguing with the then director of this place. And the director said to them, you'll never make any more money. You can't go anywhere else. We're paying y'all the best. And I thought, they don't think so. Why do I think that this is the best? So probably in about 2 weeks later, they ended up leaving. And then about a month later, I ended up leaving. And then I went and got another job. And that job was $27,000 a year. And I thought, man, this is a lot of money. I've moved up. This is my second job. It's about 3 to 4 months outside of college. I'm making $27,000. And I did really good at that job. I worked it very well. And I loved the type of work I was doing. I worked in nonprofit for about 10 years after college. So I just have a heart to help people. And when you do, it's easy to accept what you get because you're really just trying to help other folks and not so much trying to help yourself. So I worked that job And my wife and I, we then moved to Mexico, lived there for a while. We came back, and then I started working for a school. And within the school, I worked with homeless kids, and I also worked with kids that were in between or didn't have as many resources. So at first I was a homeless liaison, and then I moved to being a community school coordinator. And I remember there was a lady, her name was Kathy, and she was one of our superintendents at the school. And she said, "Hey, you should think about becoming a principal." And this was probably the first time that I thought, oh, I've been doing work that's very rewarding. I enjoy it, but I'm doing it because I just do what I'm told for the most part. Like, people gave me opportunities, I worked hard, and that's how I was moving up the ladder. And when she said that, it made me start thinking about, this is not even what I imagined for myself when I'm 65 years old. I don't imagine my 65-year-old self looking back and being happy that for roughly 35 or 40 years that I was in education. And that was the first time I remember the door is wide open. I need to start looking at what I want to do with my life and how I want to apply myself. So within about 3 months, I handed in my notice and I started my own company. And that was an interesting thing because I started to learn about business. I didn't know a single thing, and I probably shouldn't have done it the way I did. And it really lasted for about 2 months before I became a contractor for another business. And I might share more on that later. But what happened is that I started to see that there were things that you could do business-wise, and there were things that you could learn and improve, and it was in business. So it sounds insane to me now, but at that time I didn't know that starting a business, you just needed an offer. You needed to find people who wanted that and were starving for it, and then give them a way to pay for that thing. And if you could do that and deliver the service and then get paid for it, well, guess what? You have a business and you can make money. And I started getting good at that. And primarily it started in marketing, and I was helping other clients, and there was a lot of things that I learned. And I'm going to skip forward because I'm not trying to give you my life story, but just trying to give you an understanding of where this podcast has grown from. So a few years later, after working for different companies as a director of marketing, doing a stint of program development for a large fintech company, and then starting my business again, I started to make more money than I thought I would ever make, or people in my life. I wasn't even aware of people who made six figures, but I do remember starting to make more money and thinking, oh, wow, this is a thing that if you learn how to do business, if you learn how to apply yourself, you can do this. So what were my steps? How did I start growing a business and making more money and paying off debt and doing all of these things? And it really came down to personal development. And when I looked back in all the areas of my life that I really wasn't doing what was important to me, it was because I was just living someone else's story, someone else's guidance on how I should live my life, and I hadn't fully owned what I wanted to do. So the more I started to learn about this, I thought, how do I actually help other people? Because keep in mind, I've had this track record of helping with people in nonprofit. And I went to school. My bachelor's degree is in theology. My master's degree was initially going to be in counseling. So I deeply want to help people, but those things didn't pay the same when you have kids and you have a wife and you're trying to make money. I started thinking, man, I think everyone can do more than what they're doing. What are ways that you can actually teach this to people? Because a lot of people teach, personal development. There's many well-known people that do it, and I've done a lot of marketing for some of them as well. So I started learning more. And I remember starting with people like Albert Bandura, and he's one of my favorites. And I love this idea of self-efficacy. I love how he talks about improving your luck. And the way you improve your luck is you develop capabilities and capacities. You apply yourself. And then whenever you're in new situations, you're able to improve your chances, because if someone needs you for something, it's possible that you have that capacity or capability. And belief in yourself that you could probably do what they need. But if you're not prepared and you meet someone or you're given an opportunity and you're not ready, well, then guess what? You're not going to improve your chances, improve your luck or your opportunities. So he was a really big, important part for me in really sharpening ideas and thoughts. But some of his stuff felt incomplete. It wasn't like a full way to really develop yourself. But like in all psychology, everyone has a part that's important. From Albert Bandura, I started learning a lot more from people like DC and Ryan and their self-determination, self-development theory. And in their self-determination theory, they call it SDT. And it's how you understand people's motivation, how they want to grow, what are people expecting when they set a goal, if they believe they can reach this goal, what are they expecting to happen if they reach the goal, and therefore can they find the right paths to get there. Started learning about hope theory, and that was a big part. Actually, one of my professors when I was doing my master's degree does a lot of research, wrote a book on hope theory, and that was really great too, because it gave some really good ways that you could help people understand their ways, their wants, and their will to pursue things that are important and that give them hope. So there was a lot of work that I was doing, and I felt like I was getting fragmented theories. I was getting fragmented ways of understanding how people can grow and how you could teach people how to grow. But it wasn't until I started reading, I don't even know how I got this book, but I was just looking for growth, for transformation. And there's this book, and I've never even seen a picture of the guy, and I probably have 5 of his books. His name is Larry Cochran. And he was talking about the best way for transformation to happen is to look at this idea of story. And I thought, this is interesting. And I was reading his book, and of course, he starts introducing me to this huge library of people that have written about story for the longest time. And there's even a lot of research that happened in the 90s, but it kind of was overtaken by neuroscience. And he really started to change my mind about how things work and how we should view our lives, and how story is very important to that. And then I read some work by Magda B. Arnold, and she talked about how there's information that people will tell you in a story. And if you can hear their story, you can learn what type of motivation they will have towards achievement of goals and how successful they will be based off of the story. So then I kept going deeper and learning, okay, well, stories are the way that we become conscious of anything. So in order for us to be conscious of something, we have to first put it into a story, because by default, or just by design, we think everything in story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And then when we look at our life, there's things that we're going for. And if we look at ourselves as the main character, then we're able to pursue it in a proactive way. But we're unable to pursue it in a proactive way until we spot the lie and reject it. So there's all these ideas that I started learning, and then it changed the way I started to see motivation. And I started to see story as the easiest way for people to understand how they can improve their lives, because there are stories that are shaping the way that we obtain success and what success means for us. And then there's also stories that we get stuck in, or we may feel stalled in certain stories. So how do we start to change these stories if stories are the things that are really operating every part of our life? And I was able to then start looking back and going over Albert Bandura's stuff and looking at self-determination theory and all these things that I had learned, and being able to look at it through this lens of story and how everything is a story. I went to a narrative therapy conference, and that was a big part too, is just even learning how they're using it in counseling. I started seeing that people in law have legal story, how whenever they're trying to change policies in political action committees, they want to be able to tell stories and not just give you facts, because if they can tell a story, I can get an idea in your head that the facts just support the story that I already got in your head. But if I'm just telling you the facts, you won't pay attention as much. And I'm learning all this stuff about how important story is. And then I started using a lot of it on me. And one person that was big for that is Carol S. Pearson, and how she talks about archetypes. I'll talk about archetypes a lot, so I won't mention too much of it now. But even just understanding that there's certain things that have to happen for transformation. And one of those things is that for transformation to happen, you have to have energy. And energy could be thought of as these archetypes that come through our life, meaning that you'll meet some people who are always optimistic, and that's a certain type of energy that happens. And for a person to be optimistic, there's certain things and certain ways of living that they have to recognize, and that's not the easiest thing to do. And people will actually suppress that type of energy. And they're like, I can't do that, and there's a reason why. And we can think of that reason why being stories. One interesting thing about this is that most of the stories that we live by and most of the stories that run our life, they're stories that were formed under conditions we no longer live in. Let me say that again, because I felt like I was saying it and working it out. The problem is that we live by stories that were formed in a time and in conditions that we no longer live in. And because of that, there's things that we just don't see, and there's defaults that we run to that prevent us. And what I started to learn in business as I was helping people and even helping myself is that I would hit a lid, or I would hit a point where I felt stuck and I couldn't improve. And usually this point is where people go to more how-to information. Maybe I need to get another certification. Maybe I need to find another expert. Maybe there's a skill, a training, a learning, or something. There's some tips, some steps, some tactics, some trends. There's something I need that does not deal with my development. And whenever we go to that how-to mode of operating, what happens is we're going to stay stuck in a story. So I started seeing time and again with people who wanted to build a website or wanted to run a Facebook ad campaign. They would learn everything that they needed to do, whether I'm teaching them or there was Google, but there was a personal development issue that was keeping them stuck, and that was based on their stories that they were living from. So being able to help people understand how these stories work, becoming aware of them, being able to reauthor them, and then moving forward in courage is what was actually helpful and would allow people to move forward. There's this thing in story theory where the biggest thing that happens with the character is that there's some lie that they're living or they're unaware of. It could be a wound, it could be a limited perspective, but I'm gonna just say lie. And what this lie does is that it keeps them in their old strategies and in their old way of believing and behaving. And in order for this character to transform, to become the person that they need to be in order to attain whatever goal or desire or thing that they want, they have to be able to, one, understand what the lie is, and then reject it. And understanding what the lie is different than rejecting it. When you reject it, you are actually saying, I am choosing to no longer be or believe how I used to. And I saw this time and again in myself and in other people where you could give someone really good advice and you can help them spot the lie, but they're not going to move forward unless they reject the lie. So there's times in my life where it's like, oh, I want to work out. I want to do something great when it comes to getting in shape and eating healthy. And I know why I don't do it. So if I know why I don't do it, well, then that's understanding my limited perspective. That's understanding the lie. But I have to reject it. And in order for me to reject it, that means I have to start living a new way. And in order to live a new way, that means experiencing all the things that come up when I try to live a new way. And that is scary. And that's where this idea of people don't really avoid growth because they're lazy or deficient or broken. They avoid it because it feels unsafe. So when you think of story is moving from a place where you're comfortable. So separating from what is known repeatedly and going into the unknown, which is where you feel unsafe. But that's where growth happens. But going into that unsafe period also requires development on your part, because you're navigating things that don't have ready-made answers. You're navigating things that people can't tell you. They can give you their information, but you have to develop in order to how to work in this new world. And that's what all movies do, right? The person's in the new world. They're trying to understand how to work in this new world. So the problems that we encounter become pointers to our development. Problems as pointers is probably something you'll hear me say a lot as well. Problems as pointers. So the problems that we encounter become a way for us to recognize what's actually happening in this new world and how we can best start to develop, because we need problems to stay around long enough. If the problem doesn't stay around long enough, we can't develop. If the problem isn't really around long enough, well, then a skill or how-to information really is all you needed. You didn't need any development. But the problem is that whenever people don't develop, you start having people do things that disconnect them from who they are, and they'll do things that aren't true for them. And then 30 years later, they look back and say, I never really lived my life. Maybe I made a lot of money. Maybe I have a great house. Maybe I have kids, but I didn't spend any time with them because I was so busy out there doing something else that I thought I needed to do. So that middle part is where a person has to start developing personal insight in order to learn how to move forward. And hopefully this podcast on future episodes will help you understand and help you get a better idea of how can I move forward? Where is it that I'm actually getting stuck? What is the thing that's getting in my way of helping me get where I want to go? I probably should stop here. Actually, I think I will stop here. Because in the future episodes, I want to talk about how you know what things to work on, how you can get better at realizing when you're just doing busy work and then you get the result and it feels like hollow, it feels empty, but yet you got the thing. So there's a lot more that I look forward and can't wait to talk about. But I wanted to give you this first episode so that it was very clear where this podcast comes from. It really comes from a place at helping people develop. And I believe story and understanding these story concepts are the number one way, because we naturally think in it. And if people can start to have a way that they can view their world in story, understand what stories are blocking them, and be able to reauthor them, they'll find that things will go much better for them. So thank you so much for listening. If you are interested in this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. One more thing, I did write a guide recently. You can look in the show notes. It's called Reframe. And that's one of the things I do in coaching calls. And I think you might find it helpful as a way to actually start looking at what things are really important to you and how do you move towards those things. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoy the episode. And until next time, tell your friends and them.